A single glance at a stranger's hand can shatter the foundation of everything you believe to be true. For Maya Santos, a waitress drowning in her mother's medical bills, that glance came on a rain-soaked Tuesday night when she noticed the impossible, a ring identical to her mother's most treasured possession on the finger of tech billionaire Alexander Rothwell. What happened next didn't just change two lives. It exposed a 70-year-old lie that had built an empire on the ruins of a stolen dream. This isn't a story about coincidence. This is the story of how a simple observation in a harborside diner unraveled a conspiracy so deep it would shake one of America's most powerful maritime dynasties to its core. Did you know that 73% of minimum wage workers in America are over the age of 20, fighting battles that society never sees? Maya Santos was one of them, a 26-year-old woman whose hands told the story of every double shift, every skipped meal, every sleepless night spent calculating medical bills. The Harbor View Diner sat on the edge of the financial district like a forgotten relic, its neon sign flickering against the glass towers that housed billions in wealth just blocks away. Maya had learned to be invisible to the power suits who occasionally wandered in, treating her like part of the furniture. But invisibility, she was about to discover, could be the most dangerous place to hide. Tonight, that invisibility would shatter in the most unexpected way. The storm had been building all day, turning the harbor into a churning mass of grey water and white foam. By 9 p.m., the diner was nearly empty, except for a few regulars nursing coffee and the persistent hum of the ancient air conditioning unit. Maya wiped down tables with mechanical precision, her mind elsewhere, calculating whether her mother's insurance would cover the new physical therapy equipment the doctor had recommended. Elena Santos had been paralyzed from the waist down for 3 years, the result of a car accident that had left their family financially devastated. Every penny Maya earned went toward medical bills, equipment, and the small apartment they shared near the waterfront. The tips were meager, but they were survival. When the black sedan pulled up outside, Maya barely glanced up from her cleaning. Expensive cars weren't unusual in this part of town, though they rarely stopped at the Harbor View. The man who stepped out moved with the kind of controlled urgency that spoke of boardroom battles and billion-dollar decisions. His coat was tailored perfection, his shoes Italian leather that had never touched a sidewalk crack. Alexander Rothwell, though Maya didn't know his name yet, carried himself like gravity bent to his will rather than the other way around. He chose the corner booth, the one with the view of the harbor where his family's shipping empire had first taken root 70 years ago. The irony of his choice would soon become devastatingly clear. Maya approached with her practiced smile and standard greeting, but something made her pause. As Alexander reached for the menu, his sleeve pulled back slightly, revealing a ring that seemed to capture and hold the diner's fluorescent light. It was unlike anything she'd seen in the working-class world she inhabited, heavy silver with intricate engravings, crowned by a black opal that seemed to contain entire galaxies. The design was unmistakable. A compass rose with 8-pointed rays, each tip adorned with tiny nautical symbols. Maya's breath caught in her throat because she had seen this exact ring before, not in a magazine or display case, but resting in a small wooden box beside her mother's bed. The ring her grandfather had supposedly designed himself, the one thing Elena refused to sell even when the medical bills threatened to drown them. What happened next would transform a routine Tuesday night into the opening move of a game Maya didn't even know she was playing. As she set down Alexander's coffee, the words tumbled from her lips before she could stop them, a simple observation that would crack open decades of buried secrets. Alexander's reaction wasn't surprise or curiosity, but something far more dangerous. The cold, calculating stare of a man who had just realized his most carefully guarded secret might not be as secure as he'd believed. The ring on his finger wasn't just jewelry, it was evidence, a key to a vault of lies that powerful men had killed to protect. And Maya Santos, invisible waitress from the wrong side of the harbor, had just announced she knew where to find the lock. Have you ever wondered what it takes to make a billionaire's blood run cold? The words, "Sir, my mother has a ring exactly like yours," should have been meaningless. A casual observation from a tired waitress trying to make conversation. But when Maya spoke those words, Alexander Rothwell's hand froze halfway to his coffee cup, his knuckles white against the ceramic handle. The temperature in the diner seemed to drop 10 degrees as his piercing grey eyes locked onto hers with an intensity that made her step back instinctively. This wasn't the reaction of a man hearing an interesting coincidence. This was the reaction of someone whose deepest secret had just been dragged into the light by the last person on earth who should have known it existed. Alexander's voice, when he finally spoke, carried the kind of quiet menace that corporate rivals had learned to fear. "That's impossible," he said, each word measured and deliberate. "This ring has been in the Rothwell family for over 70 years. It was commissioned specifically for my grandfather, Victor Rothwell, when he founded Rothwell Maritime Industries in 1953. He turned his hand slightly, allowing the black opal to catch the light, its dark surface seeming to swirl with hidden depths. "There is no other like it. There has never been another like it." The finality in his tone wasn't just certainty, it was a warning, delivered with the casual cruelty of a man accustomed to having his word accepted without question. Maya felt something ignite in her chest, a spark of defiance that surprised even her. She had spent 3 years being polite to people who treated her like she was disposable, swallowing her pride to pay for her mother's medical care. But this man's arrogance, his assumption that she was either lying or too stupid to know what she had seen, pushed her past her breaking point. "I'm not mistaken," she said, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. "My mother's ring is identical. The compass rose, the 8 points, the black opal, even the tiny anchor engraved on the band. I've held it 1,000 times, studied every detail." She leaned forward slightly, meeting his glacial stare. "My grandfather had it made as a symbol of partnership, of shared dreams. He died believing it represented something honorable." Alexander's laugh was sharp and humorless, cutting through the diner's ambient noise like broken glass. "Your grandfather," he said, the words dripping with disdain, "was either a remarkable counterfeiter or a thief. Because the only way your mother possesses a ring like this one is if it's the original that was stolen from my family's offices in 1954. He reached into his jacket, withdrew a leather wallet, and placed $300 bills on the table. More money than Maya made in a week, treated like pocket change. "This conversation is over, miss." He paused, waiting for a name he clearly didn't expect to remember. "Santos," Maya supplied, her voice barely above a whisper. "Maya Santos. And my mother is not a thief." But Alexander was already standing, already dismissing her, already walking toward a future where this conversation had never happened. As the diner door closed behind him, Maya stood frozen in the aftermath of his accusations, the 3 crisp bills on the table feeling like blood money. The other customers had pretended not to listen, but she could feel their curious glances, their whispered speculations about what had just transpired. She picked up the money with shaking hands, knowing she couldn't afford the luxury of pride, knowing her mother needed every dollar. But as she folded the bills into her apron pocket, a cold realization settled over her like fog rolling in from the harbor. This wasn't over. It was just beginning, because somewhere in her mother's careful silences about the past, in Eleanor's protective grip on that small wooden box, lay secrets that Alexander Rothwell would kill to keep buried. And Maya had just announced to one of the most powerful men in the city that she held the key to unlocking them. The 20-minute drive to Mercy General Hospital felt like crossing into another dimension, where the sterile smell of disinfectant replaced the grease and coffee aromas of the diner. Maya's hands still trembled as she gripped the steering wheel, Alexander Rothwell's words echoing in her mind like a curse. "Your mother is either a liar or a thief." The accusation was so vile, so impossible, that it felt like being told the sun had decided to rise in the west. Elena Santos was the kind of woman who would walk 3 blocks back to a store to return a quarter in incorrect change, who had taught Maya that integrity was the only inheritance that truly mattered. Yet somewhere in the space between Alexander's absolute certainty and her mother's careful silences about the past, doubt had begun to creep in like poison through her veins. Maya found her mother in room 314, propped up in the mechanical bed that had become her world, reading a worn paperback novel by the pale light filtering through Venetian blinds. At 52, Elena looked older than her years. The weight of constant pain and financial stress etched into the lines around her dark eyes. But when she looked up and saw her daughter's face, those eyes sharpened with the fierce intelligence that no accident could diminish. "Mija, what's wrong?" Elena asked, setting aside her book and reaching out with hands that bore the calluses of a lifetime of hard work. "You look like you've seen a ghost." The irony of her words would become clear in moments, because that's exactly what Maya had encountered, the ghost of a past her family thought was buried forever. Maya pulled the visitor chair close to the bed, her mind racing with how to begin this impossible conversation. How do you tell your mother that a stranger has accused her of possessing stolen property? How do you voice suspicions about the one person who has been your anchor in every storm? The wooden box sat on Elena's bedside table, as it always did, a small, weathered treasure chest that contained the only tangible connection to the grandfather Maya had never met. Inside, nestled in faded blue velvet, lay the compass rose ring that had sparked this nightmare. "Mom," Maya began, her voice barely above a whisper, "tell me about Grandpa Diego again. Tell me about how he got the ring." Elena's expression shifted subtly, the openness replaced by something guarded, protective, the look of someone who had spent decades building walls around painful memories. Elena's gaze drifted to the window, to the harbor lights twinkling in the distance like fallen stars. "Your grandfather was a dreamer, Maya," she said, her voice taking on the careful cadence of a story told many times, but never quite completely. "He came to this country with nothing but ambition and the belief that hard work could build anything. He was brilliant, an engineer who understood ships and the sea like they were part of his soul. The ring was a symbol of partnership, he told me, forged when he and another man shook hands on a dream that would change their lives forever." She paused, her fingers unconsciously moving toward the wooden box, then stopping. "But dreams can be stolen, Mija, especially when you're an immigrant who trusts too easily. Powerful men took everything from him, his work, his reputation, his future. The ring was all he had left of what might have been." Elena's hand finally closed around the wooden box, holding it like a talisman against old wounds. "He made me promise never to sell it, no matter how desperate things became. It's not just jewelry, Elena," he would say. "It's proof. Someday when the truth comes to light, this ring will be evidence that Diego Herrera was more than they tried to make him. He died believing that justice would come, that someone would recognize what was stolen from him." Elena's eyes found Maya's, and in them was a mixture of love, fear, and something that looked like warning. "But some truths are too dangerous to pursue, Mija. Some battles are too big for people like us to fight. Tonight, when you tell me what's really troubling you, remember that your grandfather learned the hardest way possible. Sometimes the cost of being right is higher than anyone should have to pay." What do you do when the person you trust most in the world confirms your worst fears while simultaneously deepening the mystery? Maya's confession about meeting Alexander Rothwell hit Elena like a physical blow, her already pale face draining of what little color remained. The heart monitor beside the bed began beeping faster, its electronic rhythm matching the panic in Elena's eyes. "Rothwell," she whispered, the name seeming to burn her tongue. "Alexander Rothwell found you." Her grip on Maya's hand tightened with surprising strength, her fingers digging in like she was trying to anchor herself to reality. "Mia, you don't understand what you've stumbled into. That family, they don't just take what they want. They destroy anyone who threatens to expose what they've stolen." Elena's reaction confirmed Maya's growing suspicions. This wasn't about a simple case of mistaken identity. Her mother knew exactly who Alexander Rothwell was, and more importantly, she knew why his family name carried the weight of old trauma. "He said Grandpa Diego was a thief," Maya pressed, watching her mother's face for tells she'd learned to read over years of careful conversations about the past. "He said the ring was stolen from his family in 1954. But that's not true, is it, Mom? There's something you've never told me about how Grandpa really got that ring." Elena's eyes darted to the wooden box, then back to Maya, and in that moment of hesitation, Maya saw the confirmation she'd been dreading. Her mother had been protecting her from a truth too dangerous to speak aloud. Elena struggled to sit up straighter, her movements careful but determined, like a woman preparing to carry a burden she'd hoped never to lift again. "Your grandfather didn't steal that ring, Maya. But he didn't design it either. Not alone." Her voice dropped to barely above a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might summon old demons from the shadows. Diego Herrera was Victor Rothwell's partner, his equal in every way that mattered. They founded Rothwell Maritime together in 1953, two immigrants who shared a dream of building something that would last. The rings were commissioned as symbols of their partnership, two compass roses pointing toward the same destination, two men whose fates were supposed to be intertwined forever. Elena's laugh was bitter, edged with decades of suppressed rage, but Victor Rothwell had different plans for destiny. The story that poured from Elena's lips painted a picture of betrayal so systematic and cruel that Maya felt sick listening to it. Victor hadn't just stolen Diego's ideas, he'd orchestrated his complete destruction with surgical precision. "Your grandfather was brilliant, but he was also naive about American business practices. He trusted contracts written in English he barely understood, trusted handshake deals with a man who smiled while planning his downfall." Elena's voice hardened with each word, years of careful silence finally breaking apart. Victor waited until Diego had invested everything, his savings, his reputation, his heart, into their shared company. Then he used Diego's immigrant status as a weapon, fabricating evidence of customs violations, bribing officials to question Diego's shipping licenses. When Diego realized what was happening, it was too late. Victor had already rewritten the company's history, erasing Diego's name from patents, contracts, even the incorporation papers. Elena reached for the wooden box with trembling hands, opening it to reveal the compass rose ring that had started this nightmare. The night before Diego was arrested on trumped-up smuggling charges, Victor came to our apartment. He didn't come to gloat, he came to make an offer. "Give me your ring," he said, "and I'll make sure the charges disappear. Keep it, and you'll rot in prison while I build our empire on your grave." Eleanor's tears fell onto the ring's surface, and for a moment the black opal seemed to absorb them like drops of ink. "Your grandfather looked at that ring for a long time, Maya. Then he handed it over, thinking he was saving his family. But Victor lied. Diego was deported anyway, branded as a criminal, blacklisted from ever working in shipping again. And Victor kept both rings, twin symbols of a partnership he'd murdered." Elena looked up at her daughter, her eyes blazing with righteous fury that had been banked but never extinguished. "So," How did we get this ring back, you ask? That's where the story gets interesting, and where Alexander Rothwell's perfect family history starts to crumble. Can a single act of conscience unravel 70 years of carefully constructed lies? Alexander Rothwell sat in his penthouse office, the city's lights sprawling beneath him like a conquered kingdom. But for the first time in his adult life, he felt the ground shifting under his feet. The waitress's words haunted him, not because they were impossible, but because they carried the ring of absolute truth. He'd built his reputation on reading people, on knowing when someone was lying, scheming, or trying to manipulate him. Maya Santos had been none of those things. She'd been genuinely shocked, genuinely certain, genuinely hurt by his accusations. And that terrified him more than any hostile takeover or corporate scandal ever could. If she was telling the truth, then everything he believed about his family's legacy was built on quicksand. The Rothwell Maritime Archives occupied an entire floor of the corporate headquarters, a climate-controlled shrine to 7 decades of carefully curated success stories. Alexander had never questioned the narrative. Victor Rothwell, the visionary founder who'd built an empire from nothing, who'd survived the cutthroat world of 1950s, shipping through determination and business acumen. The official biography made no mention of partners, of shared dreams, of rings forged as symbols of brotherhood. It was the story of a self-made man, clean and inspiring and completely fabricated. As Alexander pulled file after file from the secured cabinets, he began to see the gaps, months of missing correspondence from 1954, incorporation papers that had been amended multiple times, insurance claims for stolen company property that were never fully explained. Someone had spent decades sanitizing the historical record, and they'd done it with surgical precision. The breakthrough came in a misfiled folder tucked behind tax documents from 1955. It was a single page, a letter written in Victor Rothwell's careful script to someone identified only as MR, likely Marcus Rothwell, Alexander's great-uncle, who'd served as the company's first legal counsel. The contents made Alexander's blood run cold. The Herrera problem has been resolved permanently. All documentation linking him to our partnership has been destroyed or amended. The authorities are satisfied with the evidence we provided regarding his smuggling activities. He will be deported within the week, and I've ensured he'll never work in shipping again. The ring he surrendered will remain in our vault as insurance. Should he ever attempt to resurface or make claims against the company, it will serve as evidence of his guilt rather than his partnership. Alexander read the letter 3 times, each reading making the implications clearer and more damning. But it was the final paragraph that transformed Victor from a mere corporate criminal into something far more sinister. I've commissioned a second ring, identical to Diego's, to replace the one he surrendered. No one must ever know there were originally 2. The story must be that there was only ever one Rothwell family ring, stolen by a criminal employee and recovered through proper legal channels. Diego Herrera's name will be erased from all corporate records. His contributions will be attributed to our research department. His patents will be refiled under Rothwell ownership. By the time this is complete, it will be as if Diego Herrera never existed. Alexander's hands shook as he held the letter, understanding finally why his grandfather had been so obsessed with controlling the family narrative, why certain topics had always been forbidden, why the company's early history had always felt oddly incomplete. Victor hadn't just stolen a business, he'd committed historical murder, assassinating Diego Herrera's very existence. The phone call to his private investigator lasted exactly 4 minutes and changed everything Alexander thought he knew about justice. "Find me everything you can about Diego Herrera," he instructed, his voice steady despite the chaos in his mind. "I want employment records, immigration documents, family history, and most importantly, I want to know if he had any descendants still living in the city." As he hung up the phone, Alexander walked to his office safe and withdrew a small velvet box he'd inherited along with his grandfather's ring. Inside was a second compass rose ring, identical to the one on his finger, except for a tiny engraving on the inner band. Initials that had never made sense to him before. D.H. Partner. 1953-1954. Diego Herrera, partner. The evidence of his grandfather's crime had been sitting in the family vault for 70 years, waiting for someone with enough courage to recognize what it represented. Now, Alexander faced the hardest decision of his life: protect the empire built on lies, or tear it down in service of a truth that would destroy everything he'd inherited, including himself. What happens when a daughter's loyalty collides with a mother's deepest fears? Maya sat in stunned silence as Elena's story reached its climax, the revelation hanging between them like a live wire. "The ring we have," Elena whispered, her voice barely audible over the hospital's ambient noise, "isn't the one your grandfather surrendered to Victor. 3 days after Diego's deportation, a stranger appeared at my door, a young man, maybe 25, with eyes that held too much pain for his age. He said his name was Daniel, and he worked for Rothwell Maritime, but he wasn't there as Victor's employee. He was there as Victor's son." Elena's hands trembled as she continued. Daniel had watched his father destroy Diego, had seen the evidence planted, the officials bought, the lies constructed, and he couldn't live with it. So he brought us this ring, Victor's own compass rose, stolen from his father's safe, as proof of what really happened. The implications crashed over Maya like a tidal wave, reshaping everything she thought she understood about their family's tragedy. Daniel Rothwell hadn't just been a guilty bystander. He'd been an active saboteur of his own father's crimes, risking everything to ensure that someday, somehow, the truth could surface. "He told me to keep it hidden," Elena continued, her voice gaining strength as she relived that pivotal moment. "Said that Victor would kill to get it back, but that one day it might be the only thing standing between our family and complete erasure from history. Daniel promised he would find a way to make things right, to restore your grandfather's name and return what was stolen. But 3 weeks later, his body was found in the harbor, an apparent suicide, the newspapers said, though Daniel's final letter to me suggested otherwise." Elena reached into the wooden box and withdrew a yellowed envelope Maya had never seen before. "He left this with me, insurance that Victor's crimes wouldn't die with him." Maya's hands shook as she opened the envelope, revealing photographs that would have destroyed Victor Rothwell if they'd ever seen daylight, images of forged documents, recorded conversations with bribed officials, and most damning of all, a handwritten confession detailing every aspect of the conspiracy against Diego Herrera. But it was the final photograph that took Maya's breath away. Victor and Diego standing together in front of their newly incorporated company, both wearing identical compass rose rings, both smiling with the innocent optimism of men who believed their partnership would last forever. The image was dated March 15th, 1953, proof positive that Diego Herrera had been an equal founder, not an employee, not a criminal, but a victim of the most systematic character assassination Maya had ever encountered. "Daniel died trying to right his father's wrongs," Elena said, tears streaming down her face, "and I've spent 30 years too terrified to honor his sacrifice." The weight of this revelation settled on Maya's shoulders like a mantle she never asked to wear. She understood now why her mother had been so protective of their family's secrets, why every conversation about the past had been carefully edited to exclude the most dangerous truths. They weren't just keeping a ring, they were harboring evidence of murder, conspiracy, and corporate theft on a scale that would topple one of the city's most powerful dynasties. "Mom," Maya said slowly, her voice steady despite the chaos in her mind, Alexander Rothwell isn't just some distant relative of the man who destroyed Grandpa Diego. He's Victor's grandson. And if Daniel was his uncle, then Alexander is the son of the very family member who tried to make things right. The irony was almost poetic. The man who'd accused Elena of theft was himself the heir to stolen goods, while the family he'd dismissed as criminals were the rightful guardians of evidence that could restore their honor. Elena gripped Maya's hands with desperate intensity, her eyes blazing with a mixture of fear and fierce maternal protection. "Promise me you won't pursue this, Mija. Promise me you'll let sleeping dogs lie." Daniel paid with his life for trying to expose Victor's crimes, and nothing has changed. The Rothwells still have power, still have connections, still have the resources to destroy anyone who threatens their empire. But even as Elena spoke the words, Maya could see in her mother's eyes that she knew it was too late for promises, too late for silence. The collision between past and present had already occurred, and now there was only one path forward. Through the storm, not around it. "I can't promise that, Mom," Maya said softly, her voice carrying the weight of inherited responsibility. "Because if we don't fight for Grandpa Diego's honor now, if we don't use the evidence Daniel died protecting, then their sacrifices mean nothing. And Alexander Rothwell deserves to know that everything he's built his life on is a lie. Just like we deserve to know that everything we believed about our family's shame was a fabrication designed to keep us quiet and powerless. How do you prepare to go to war with someone who doesn't even know you exist?" Alexander's private investigator worked with the efficiency of a surgeon, dissecting Maya Santos's life layer by layer until every detail lay exposed under the harsh light of scrutiny. The report that arrived 48 hours later painted a picture of quiet desperation wrapped in stubborn dignity, a young woman working double shifts to pay for her paralyzed mother's care, living paycheck to paycheck in a world where one medical emergency could destroy everything they'd built. But it was the final section of the report that stopped Alexander cold. The genealogical research that traced Elena Santos back to her maiden name. Elena Herrera, daughter of Diego Herrera, the man his grandfather had systematically destroyed. The waitress wasn't just someone who'd stumbled onto his family's secret. She was the living embodiment of Victor Rothwell's greatest crime, walking proof that some sins echo across generations. Alexander stood in his office at 3 a.m., the city quiet below him, holding a photograph his investigator had uncovered from the Maritime Licensing Board's archives. It showed two men shaking hands in front of a half-built warehouse, their faces bright with the optimism of shared dreams. Victor Rothwell looked younger, leaner, almost innocent in his pressed suit and confident smile. Beside him stood Diego Herrera, and Alexander felt the breath leave his lungs as he recognized the same determined jawline, the same fierce intelligence in the eyes that he'd seen in Maya Santos just nights before. This wasn't just corporate theft. It was fratricide, the murder of a partnership that should have built an empire together. The warehouse behind them bore a sign that made Alexander's chest tighten. Rothwell and Herrera Maritime, founded 1953. Someone had taken great care to ensure this photograph never made it into the official company archives. The deeper Alexander dug into his family's sanitized history, the more obvious the cover-up became. Entire months of correspondence were missing from 1954, replaced by carefully typed summaries that mentioned only routine business operations. Patents filed under Diego's name had been mysteriously transferred to Rothwell Maritime, with no record of sale or assignment. Most damning of all, Alexander found a safety deposit box key hidden in his grandfather's desk, along with a note in Victor's handwriting. Insurance, DH Materials, open only in case of exposure. The box, when Alexander finally located it at First National Bank, contained Diego's original partnership agreement, signed contracts proving his equal status in the company, and a confession letter that Diego had apparently been forced to sign before his deportation. A document so obviously coerced that it read like a hostage note, stilted and unnatural, nothing like the passionate, articulate voice in Diego's earlier correspondence. But the most devastating discovery came from an unexpected source: Alexander's own father's private papers, which had been sealed after his death 5 years earlier. Hidden among insurance documents and investment portfolios was a letter dated 1987, written in his father Marcus's careful script and addressed to Alexander himself, to be opened only when the Herrera truth can no longer be contained. G. The letter revealed that Marcus Rothwell had spent decades trying to locate Diego's descendants, driven by guilt over his father's crimes and his own complicity in maintaining the lie. "Your grandfather was a monster," the letter stated with brutal honesty, "and I was a coward who chose prosperity over justice. Daniel tried to be the moral compass our family needed, and Victor had him killed for it, made to look like suicide, but I knew better. The ring Daniel stole wasn't just evidence. It was a message, proof that someone in our family still believed in honor over profit." The letter went on to detail Marcus's failed attempts to track down Diego's family, his frustrated efforts to find evidence that could posthumously clear Diego's name. The final paragraph of his father's confession letter left Alexander reeling, transforming his understanding of family loyalty forever. "If you're reading this, son, it means the past has finally caught up with us, and you have a choice to make. The same choice I faced and failed to make courageously. You can protect the empire built on Diego Herrera's grave, preserve the lie that's made us wealthy and powerful, and live with the knowledge that everything we are came from destroying an innocent man and his family. Or you can do what I never had the courage to do, tear it all down in service of the truth, return what was stolen, and build something new on honest ground." Alexander set the letter down with trembling hands, understanding finally that this wasn't just about Maya Santos or her mother, or even Diego Herrera's stolen legacy. This was about whether the Rothwell name would continue to represent the casual cruelty of unchecked power, or whether it could be transformed into something worthy of the partnership his grandfather had murdered. The choice his father had been too weak to make now fell to him, and unlike Marcus Rothwell, Alexander had no intention of taking the coward's way out. What drives a man who has everything to risk losing it all? Alexander's second encounter with Maya Santos was orchestrated with the precision of a military operation. But when he walked into the Harborview diner at exactly 11:47 p.m., 3 minutes before Maya's shift ended, his carefully rehearsed words died in his throat. She looked exhausted, her shoulders carrying the weight of double shifts and sleepless nights, but there was something different in her posture now, a steel-backed determination that hadn't been there during their first meeting. When she saw him, her reaction wasn't fear or surprise. It was the cold, calculating assessment of a woman who'd spent days preparing for war. "Mr. Rothwell," she said, her voice steady as granite, "I wondered when you'd come back. I assume you've done your homework by now." The transformation was startling. The nervous waitress had been replaced by someone who understood exactly what stakes they were playing for. Alexander had intended to begin with an apology, to ease into the conversation with diplomatic grace, but Maya's directness cut through his corporate conditioning like a blade. "I know who you are," he said simply, abandoning all pretense. "Elena Herrera Santos, daughter of Diego Herrera, my grandfather's former business partner. I know what Victor Rothwell did to your family, and I know that everything I was taught about our company's founding was a carefully constructed lie." The admission hung between them like a bridge neither was sure they wanted to cross. Maya's expression shifted slightly, surprise flickering across her features before being replaced by something harder, more dangerous. Former business partner, she repeated, her voice sharp with irony. Is that what you're calling it now? Partnership implies equality, Mr. Rothwell. What your grandfather did was theft, pure and simple. She untied her apron with deliberate slowness, never breaking eye contact. The question is, what are you planning to do about it? The conversation that followed took place in Alexander's car. Neutral territory, away from the diner's curious ears and the hospital's sterile constraints. As Maya recounted her mother's story, as she described Daniel Rothwell's sacrifice and the evidence that had been hidden for decades, Alexander felt the last of his illusions crumble. The young man who died in the harbor wasn't just Victor's son. He was Alexander's uncle, a family member whose very existence had been erased from the official genealogy as thoroughly as Diego Herrera's partnership had been deleted from corporate records. My father wrote me a letter, Alexander said quietly, sharing Marcus's confession for the first time with someone outside his family. He knew the truth, lived with it for decades, but never had the courage to make it right. He died carrying that guilt. Maya's expression softened slightly, recognizing in Alexander's voice the same pain she'd heard in her mother's stories about Diego's broken dreams. The moment that changed everything came when Maya produced a manila envelope from her purse, the same envelope Elena had shown her, containing Daniel's final gift to the truth. The photograph spoke louder than any confession could. Victor and Diego, as equal partners, signed contracts proving shared ownership, forged documents that had been used to frame an innocent man. But it was the final item that made Alexander's hands shake, a copy of the Maritime Licensing Board's original incorporation papers, clearly showing Rothwell and Herrera Maritime Industries as the company's legal name, with both men listed as co-founders and equal shareholders. Your grandfather didn't just steal my grandfather's ideas, Maya said, her voice steady despite the enormity of what she was revealing. He stole his identity, his legacy, his very existence. And then he made sure that anyone who might remember the truth would be too terrified or too dead to speak. The evidence was overwhelming, undeniable, and completely damning. Alexander stared at the photographs, understanding finally that he stood at the same crossroads that had faced his father and his uncle decades earlier. The choice was stark and unforgiving. Preserve the empire built on Diego Herrera's grave, or tear it down in service of a truth that would destroy everything the Rothwell name represented. But as he looked at Maya Santos, Diego's granddaughter, inheritor of a legacy that should have been as powerful as his own, Alexander realized that the choice had already been made the moment he'd decided to seek out the truth. There's going to be a board meeting next week, he said, his voice carrying the weight of irrevocable decision. Rothwell Maritime's quarterly review, attended by every major shareholder and stakeholder in the company. If we're going to do this, if we're going to expose what really happened and make it right, that's our stage. Maya nodded slowly, understanding that they were no longer adversaries, but allies in a battle against the ghosts of their grandfather's generation. The war for truth was about to begin, and this time the Herreras wouldn't fight it alone. Can you destroy a lie that's had 70 years to take root and grow into an empire? The Rothwell Maritime boardroom occupied the entire top floor of the downtown headquarters, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering a commanding view of the harbor where Diego Herrera's dreams had first taken shape. 23 of the city's most powerful business leaders sat around the mahogany table, their combined wealth representing billions in assets and decades of carefully cultivated relationships. They'd come expecting Alexander's standard quarterly presentation, profit margins, expansion plans, the usual corporate theater. Instead, they found themselves witnesses to the most spectacular act of corporate suicide in the city's history. Maya stood at the back of the room, invisible in her borrowed business attire, holding a briefcase that contained enough evidence to level a dynasty. She'd never felt more terrified or more alive in her life. Alexander began his presentation exactly as he had dozens of times before, clicking through slides of revenue growth and market projections, lulling the board into comfortable complacency. But 20 minutes in, something shifted. "Before we discuss our expansion into the Pacific markets," he said, his voice carrying a new weight, "I think it's important that this board understand the true history of how Rothwell Maritime came to exist." The slides changed, and suddenly the room was looking at a photograph they'd never seen before. Victor and Diego as equal partners, their hands clasped in front of their newly incorporated company. The silence that followed was absolute, the kind of quiet that precedes earthquakes. Board member Patricia Hawthorne leaned forward, her voice sharp with confusion. "Alexander, what is this? Who is this second man?" The question hung in the air like a blade waiting to fall. What happened next would be dissected in business schools for decades, a masterclass in controlled demolition, as Alexander systematically dismantled every pillar of his family's legacy. He told them about Diego Herrera, about the partnership that had been erased from history, about the forged documents and bought officials that had transformed an equal founder into a convenient scapegoat. With each revelation, the boardroom grew more tense, more divided, as longtime allies began to see the legal implications of what Alexander was confessing. "You're describing criminal conspiracy," said board member Thomas Chen, his face pale with realization. "Corporate fraud on a scale that could trigger federal investigation. Why are you telling us this?" Alexander's smile was cold as Winter Harbor water. "Because the evidence is about to become public anyway, and I'd rather you heard it from me than from the FBI agents who'll be serving warrants next week." The breaking point came when Alexander introduced Maya to the room, not as a waitress or an outsider, but as Diego Herrera's granddaughter and the rightful heir to half of everything they thought they owned. The briefcase opened like Pandora's box, spilling photographs, contracts, and Daniel Rothwell's confession across the polished table. Maya's voice, when she finally spoke, cut through the room's stunned silence like a sword through silk. "My grandfather died believing he was a criminal, that he deserved what happened to him. My mother lived her entire life carrying the shame of a crime that never happened. Your company has prospered for 70 years on stolen ground, and that ends today." The legal documents she placed before them weren't just evidence, they were a reckoning. Papers that would transfer half of Rothwell Maritime's assets to the Herrera estate, making Maya Santos one of the wealthiest women in the city overnight. But it was the final revelation that shattered the room's last illusions about damage control and legal maneuvering. Alexander produced a recording device, its red light blinking like a warning beacon. "This entire meeting has been recorded and transmitted live to federal investigators," he announced, his voice steady despite the chaos erupting around the table. "Every word you've spoken, every reaction you've had to learning about these crimes is now part of the official record. Those of you who choose to fight the evidence, who attempt to cover this up or discredit the victims, will be prosecuted as accessories after the fact." The room exploded into accusations, threats, and desperate attempts at damage control, but Alexander remained calm at the storm's center. He'd just committed the most expensive act of conscience in corporate history, and judging by the satisfaction in Maya's eyes as she watched 70 years of lies finally crumble, it had been worth every penny. The Rothwell empire was falling, but from its ashes, something honest might finally rise, a partnership between families that should have been united from the beginning, built on truth instead of the graves of innocent men. What does it sound like when a 70-year-old lie finally dies? The answer came at 3:47 a.m., when Maya's phone erupted with calls from reporters, federal agents, and lawyers who'd been monitoring the live feed from the Rothwell boardroom. The recording Alexander had transmitted hadn't just reached law enforcement, it had been simultaneously broadcast to every major news outlet in the city, ensuring that no amount of corporate influence could bury the story. By sunrise, the headlines screamed across every platform: "Maritime dynasty built on murder and theft," "The Herrera Files, how America's shipping empire was stolen," and most damning of all, Rothwell heir confesses to decades of corporate crime. Dude, the phones at Rothwell Maritime rang non-stop as shareholders, creditors, and business partners scrambled to distance themselves from a company that had just become radioactive. Maya watched the news coverage from her mother's hospital room, Elena's eyes wide with disbelief as anchor after anchor repeated Diego Herrera's name, not as a criminal, but as a victim whose story had finally been told. The federal investigation that followed moved with the swift efficiency of a machine that had been waiting decades for this moment. FBI Financial Crimes Unit seized every computer, every filing cabinet, every scrap of paper from Rothwell Maritime's headquarters, while forensic accountants began the massive task of unwinding 70 years of creative bookkeeping. The evidence Maya and Alexander had provided served as a roadmap, leading investigators to Swiss bank accounts, shell corporations, and a network of bribed officials that stretched back to the Eisenhower administration. Within 48 hours, 3 current board members had been arrested on charges ranging from conspiracy to obstruct justice to accessory after-the-fact to murder. Daniel Rothwell's suicide was officially reclassified as a homicide, making every person who'd helped cover up the truth complicit in his death. The dominoes fell with breathtaking speed, each arrest leading to new revelations, new evidence, new names on the growing list of conspirators who'd helped maintain Victor Rothwell's monstrous lie. But it was the civil lawsuit that truly demonstrated the scope of justice Maya and Alexander had unleashed. The legal documents filed in federal court didn't just seek monetary damages. They demanded the complete restructuring of Rothwell Maritime's ownership, the transfer of assets that rightfully belonged to Diego Herrera's estate, and most significantly, the establishment of a Truth and Reconciliation Commission to identify every person and family that had been destroyed by Victor Rothwell's systematic campaign of character assassination. The numbers were staggering. Half of Rothwell Maritime's current value, approximately $2.3 billion, legally belonged to the Herrera family, making Maya Santos overnight one of the most powerful women in American shipping. The lawsuit's most devastating paragraph listed the crimes in clinical detail: corporate conspiracy, identity theft, patent fraud, customs violations, bribery of federal officials, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy to commit murder in the first degree. Each charge carried not just financial penalties, but criminal implications that would haunt the Rothwell name for generations. The personal cost of victory became clear when Elena suffered a massive stroke 3 days after the story broke, the decades of suppressed trauma finally overwhelming her fragile system. As Maya sat beside her mother's bed, watching machines breathe for the woman who'd carried Diego's secret for 30 years, she understood that justice always comes with a price, and sometimes that price is paid by the very people you're fighting to protect. Elena's last coherent words were whispered through tears of vindication. "Tell your grandfather his name is clean now. Tell him Diego Herrera was no criminal. He was a builder of dreams that other men stole." The irony was cruel and perfect. Elena had lived just long enough to see her father's honor restored, but not long enough to enjoy the wealth and recognition that restoration brought. Her death certificate listed the cause as cerebral hemorrhage, but Maya knew better. Her mother had died of a broken heart that had finally been allowed to heal. The funeral of Elena Santos became something unprecedented in the city's history, a public memorial that drew thousands of people who'd never known Diego Herrera's granddaughter, but understood the larger story she represented. Alexander Rothwell stood at Maya's side as speaker after speaker talked about the courage it takes to confront generational injustice, about the price ordinary families pay when powerful men decide to rewrite history. The mayor proclaimed it Elena Herrera Santos Day and announced that the harbor marina would be renamed in Diego's honor, a fitting tribute to a man whose partnership had built the infrastructure that made the port city possible. But the moment that crystallized everything came when Alexander placed both compass rose rings, his grandfather's and the one Daniel had died protecting, on Elena's casket, finally reuniting the symbols of a partnership that should never have been broken. As the casket was lowered into the ground, Maya felt the weight of inherited trauma lifting from her shoulders, replaced by something she'd never expected to possess: the power to ensure that no family would ever again suffer what the Herreras had endured. Justice had been served, but more than that, the future had been reclaimed from the sins of the past. Can redemption truly heal the wounds carved by generations of injustice, or does it simply create new scars on different hearts? 6 months after Elena's funeral, Maya Santos stood in the executive suite that had once belonged to Victor Rothwell, watching ships navigate the harbor that bore her grandfather's name. The Diego Herrera Maritime Foundation occupied 3 floors of the renovated Rothwell building, its mission statement carved in bronze letters across the lobby wall. Partnership, not predation. Innovation, not appropriation. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The granddaughter of the man Victor had tried to erase now controlled the empire built on his grave, wielding power that would have been unthinkable just months before. But power, Maya was learning, came with complications that revenge fantasies never bothered to mention. Every decision she made rippled through hundreds of lives, and the weight of that responsibility felt heavier than any medical bill or double shift ever had. The Foundation's first major initiative had been elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its implications: a comprehensive audit of every patent, contract, and business acquisition Rothwell Maritime had made since 1954, searching for other Diego Herreras whose innovations had been stolen and buried. The results painted a picture of systematic intellectual theft that spanned decades. A Korean War veteran whose revolutionary cargo container design had been appropriated without credit, a team of Cuban engineers whose harbor automation systems had been claimed by Victor's R&D department, dozens of immigrant inventors whose dreams had been harvested to feed the Rothwell empire. Maya's legal team worked 18-hour days identifying descendants, locating survivors, building cases for restitution that would reshape not just the shipping industry, but the very concept of corporate accountability. The Foundation's conference rooms buzzed with the voices of translators, genealogists, and investigators, all working to resurrect stories that powerful men had tried to bury forever. But for every victory, every patent restored to its rightful owner, every family finally receiving recognition for their stolen legacy, Maya discovered new depths to the trauma Victor Rothwell had inflicted. The psychological damage rippled through generations like waves from a dropped stone. Children who'd grown up believing their immigrant parents were failures. Grandchildren who'd internalized shame about their family's supposed inadequacies, entire bloodlines convinced they were cursed with bad luck rather than victimized by calculated cruelty. The Foundation's Victim Services Department, headed by a team of therapists specializing in intergenerational trauma, worked to help families process not just financial restitution, but emotional healing. Some embraced the truth with relief and vindication. Others struggled with anger so deep and pure it threatened to consume them. Maya found herself mediating between family members who wanted blood and those who wanted peace, understanding for the first time that justice wasn't a destination but an ongoing process of choosing compassion over vengeance. Alexander's transformation had been the most unexpected element of the entire ordeal, watching him evolve from entitled billionaire to something resembling an actual human being with startling speed. He'd liquidated his personal assets to fund the foundation's operations, moved out of his penthouse into a modest apartment near the harbor, and spent his days working alongside Maya to rebuild what his family had destroyed. The partnership that emerged between them wasn't romantic. Too much history stood between their families for anything that simple, but it was profound in ways that surprised them both. They worked with the intensity of people trying to outrun generational ghosts, Alexander driven by inherited guilt and Maya by inherited rage, both learning that the most effective weapon against systemic injustice was methodical, relentless competence. Their shared mission had forged them into something neither had been alone, a force powerful enough to challenge not just one corrupt company, but an entire system that allowed such companies to flourish. The moment that crystallized everything Maya had learned about the true cost and value of justice came on a foggy Tuesday morning when she stood on the dock where her grandfather and Victor had first shaken hands in 1953. Alexander was beside her, both of them wearing the compass rose rings that had started their journey, his grandfather's and the one Daniel had died protecting, now symbols not of division but of unity restored. In her other hand, Maya held a letter from Carmen Rodriguez, a 78-year-old woman in Miami whose father had designed the hydraulic loading systems that Victor had stolen in 1962. "Thank you for giving me back my papa's good name," the letter read. "I am 78 years old, and for the first time in my life, I am proud to be his daughter." That letter, multiplied by dozens of others like it, represented something more valuable than the billions in assets Maya now controlled. It represented the restoration of dignity to people who'd been taught to be ashamed of their own heritage. As she and Alexander threw flowers into the harbor water, Maya understood that they weren't just honoring the dead. They were creating a legacy that would ensure no future Diego Herrera would die thinking himself a failure when he was actually a victim of other men's greed.